Welcome back to Plantopia. Plantopia is the plant health podcast of the American Phytopathological Society, and I'm your host, Matt Kasson. I'm an associate professor of forest pathology and mycology at West Virginia University. The views and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host, the American Phytopathological Society, or any affiliated entity. This is the fourth episode of 2026 and our 71st episode since April 2020, if you can believe it. Today, I'm excited to welcome back Dr. Jim Bradeen, former Plantopia host from 2022 through 2023, to talk with me about this podcast. As some of you already know, we're currently on the hunt for a new host and or co-host, and to do that, I thought we'd talk about how this all got started, where we are now, and where we see us going in the future. Welcome, Jim. It's great to have you back.
It's amazing to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Matt.
Yeah, the last time you were here as a guest was on our January 2024 episode, Spurring Onward. So it's been a bit. How are you and what have you been up to?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. It's, I guess, the last couple of years, the big changes in my professional life. And I think last time I was here, I spoke about the Colorado State University Spur campus, the CSU Spur campus, which is located in Denver. It's a outward-facing campus, and I was really very proud to be part of the startup of that, working to bring academic programming to that unique site. But this past year, I've moved on. I've actually returned to my faculty role. So I'm a professor at Colorado State University. And after 12 years in leadership, really eager and happy to re-engage with teaching and research. And it's been a bit of a dessert in my career.
Yeah. So it feels good to be back in the trenches is what you're saying.
It does. And I love leadership and still believe deeply in the importance of good leadership and happy to pass that baton on.
Yeah, absolutely. I know David Goodari isn't here with us today, and he obviously served as first host of Plantopia in 2020, recording some 20 episodes in 8 months, just like a powerhouse. I thought we could start by talking about the origins of Plantopia. Would you be willing to remind our listeners how Plantopia came about and how it got to when you took over?
Yeah, absolutely. So the origins of Plantopia are really related to the United Nations declaring 2020 the International Year of Plant Health. The timing was not ideal because, of course, the COVID pandemic. So the APS Council at the time recognized the value of a public outreach around the plant health space. So raising awareness amongst a broad population that plants get sick, that plant health is really a very important issue, informing our government leaders of the importance of plant health research and investing in that space. So there were a whole series of different activities planned around the International Year of Plant Health. And Plantopia emerged as part of that planning process. Its original form, and David Goodari was an amazing first host of Plantopia. The original form, it was perceived as an opportunity to speak to a broad, informed lay public about what plant health is, the many different flavors of plant health, and why it's important. So it was really imagined as a sort of a one-off series. And then starting in 2022, our APS council was led by President Martin Gleason at the time. And there was a decision made to really relaunch Plantopia and reimagine it as a resource for plant pathologists and other allied scientists. So it took on a new flavor at that point, and I had the privilege of coming on as that host to help deliver on the new vision. So in that rebirth, I guess, of Plantopia,
Right.
we really focused not only on the research, but also on the scientists behind the research. So recognizing that we all have really unique paths, interesting stories, both as scientists and as humans. So the Plantopia really aimed to capture that flavor.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that. But coming back to this, when you took over, the rebirth of Plantopia shifted more towards something still for the general public, but more geared towards communicating with other people within our professional society. Other plant pathologists were part of our target audience because we were speaking to the plant pathology, but we are also speaking about the plant pathologist. So in a way, it was learning about some of our colleagues a little bit better. Was that something that you helped make that shift, or was that that shift was a conscious decision before you took over and you just moved with it, or did you help shape that?
I think it was a bit of both. The rebirth of Plantopia was a decision of the APS Council. Now, I was serving on council at the time as the internal communications officer, so I was certainly at the table. There were broad discussions about how Plantopia should be positioned, but there was also a real opportunity as the host for me to shape that a bit. So I would say it was a combination of our leadership wanting Plantopia to serve our society in different ways, and my personal interest in knowing more about the person behind the science.
I think we share that. Obviously, we're both really, I don't know, we're chatty people that like to talk with other folks. And
This is going to be a long episode, everyone.
I see Plantopia as a means to showcase plant pathogens and the pathologists that study them. But I find that learning about the people's journeys to be the more interesting part for me and really intriguing. And I think some would argue that after a certain point, it becomes a bit of a distraction. So they just keep listening to episodes where they're showcasing one journey after another. And I think most will agree that having both components in there is important. But I find it particularly hard to balance how much pathogen versus how much pathologist we put in there. Do you think that's challenging? What are your thoughts on that?
That's an amazing question, and I would love to hear directly from some of our listeners what their experiences are. I think when I was hosting, I was always trying to find that balance, and I also think like you, I'm pretty passionate about our science. So I found that the conversations were really organic, and one piece, the sort of the personal path, really bled right into the science. I think you're right that there has to be a balance. For me, it always was an organic feel, and I hope for our listeners that I got that, but would really love to know what people are thinking about it.
So I've been thinking a lot about just the episodes that I've done. And I think to me, Plantopia would work better if we thought of it as taking a multi-categorical approach. And what I mean by that is like, I've gone back and thought about a few of the episodes that I've done. For example, Going Viral with Dr. Libby Sinowitz and Vampire Plants with Dr. Jim Westwood. Those episodes could serve as a real companion to a general plant pathology course. And I think there's a real opportunity to have some episodes that serve that very purpose to help supplement, to provide educational materials for professors like us that are teaching plant pathology that could speak to the students that are listening to real life examples and case studies of plant pathologists doing just that, studying viruses, studying parasitic plants, studying fastidious prokaryotes. But I also think there's a need for other types of episodes. And I've thought a lot about this. The things that I've done and you've done, like showcasing APS fellows. I think it's really important that this podcast serve as an archive for the careers of late stage professionals that have contributed greatly to our society and letting their stories be told. But I also think it's important to mix in interesting folks that are still in the plant and plant health space, but have nothing to do with academia and are not plant pathologists, but have really interesting stories to tell. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, yes, all of that. And I think you're hitting on something really important, that Plantopia is obviously a product of the American Phytopathological Society. We aim to serve the interests of our society, but it also has its own flavor. And you as host obviously bring a perspective and an approach that would be different than I did or David did before me. And I think there's real value in that. I think that alone showcases a human aspect of our work. Finding that balance, I think, is absolutely critical. I will say that as host, you and I and David obviously have played such an important role in who ends up on the show. But there's also behind the scenes, there's that sort of a cast of thousands that supports this podcast and the host as well, starting with our Plantopia steering committee. So I'm currently leading that as the immediate past host, but it's a collection of 7 individuals, and Matt and you and I are 2 of those folks, but folks in plant pathology that are our ears to the ground, that help us source those interesting stories, those interesting angles, whether we're focused on different career stages or different career paths, or it's more of a personal nature, as you're alluding to. The steering committee is an important asset. Of course, this continued support of our APS Council, including the financial underwriting for this podcast, APS staff, and Jessica in particular, our APS staff, a really great liaison supporting this. And then association briefings with Colby and Frank, who are behind the scenes experts that make us sound good. There are lots of folks that weigh in here. So finding that balance, absolutely, Matt, you, I, David before me, played really important role in that, but we don't do it alone either.
Yeah, and actually, it brings me into talking about what we've done over the last 6 years collectively, because this got started in 2020, as there's no podcast episodes from 2021, and then it was reimagined and started up again in 2022 when you took over. We're at 70 episodes in over the last 6 years. Actually, this episode will be 71, and that works out to some 14 episodes per year. Now we're at really one episode a month. And with David, his first 20 episodes, and you with 24, and I'm 26 episodes in. And I think about the types of guests that we try to get and the guests we end up with. And just to break down my 26, 19 of those were academics, 4 USDA scientists, 1 industry scientist, 1 lobbyist. And maybe a new listener would say, that's a lot of academics. Does that really represent the field? And the truth is, there's a little bit of bureaucracy at work there, because you can't just get permission sometimes to have a government scientist represent the agency on a podcast. Getting permission, we have, as academics, we have a lot more freedom, academic freedom, to be able to come on podcasts. And I think that's been challenging, a little bit disheartening to me, is because I want more voices of non-academics, but it's hard to get them permission to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that I experienced as well. And Matt, behind the scenes, you and I have had that conversation multiple times. So maybe this is a call to arms for our listeners. If there are folks out there that don't hear their voice on this podcast, whether you're in industry or government or NGO or any other space, and you've got something to contribute, please reach out. We do want to hear the voices. And the fact that we are so academic heavy, is, as you really eloquently said, Matt, is not a reflection of where the field of plant pathology is or where the society is a necessity or an artifact, let's say, of our ability to source interesting speakers.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great things that have come out through having this committee and developing this podcast over the years is having protocols in place and thinking about code of conduct and that. And that's one of the things, is it's easier to reach within our society for guests, because we could ask them to agree with our code of conduct. But if you brought someone in from outside, then it would be harder in that sense, because they may not align with our professional society's values and things like that. And that becomes challenging because you're trying to balance all these things. You want to represent, obviously, distinct and diverse guests and opinions, but you also want to do so in a respectful atmosphere.
Yeah, I think that balance is critical, isn't it? It's our product is not necessarily the voice of APS. It is produced by APS. So we do want to honor the diversity of our membership as well as our code of conduct.
Yeah. I read an interesting fact online about podcasts and podcast popularity. It's really eye-opening. Podcasts in the top 1%. We're not in the top 1%. We knew that. Just like none of us are in the top 1% of earners in this country. It's okay to be outside that top 1%. But popular podcasts in the top 1% generate 4,600 downloads per episode within 1 week. 4,600. Plantopia's most listened to episode, Arms Race, Part 1, UG99. This was the first episode done by David on April 9th, 2020, is at 3,010 listens, downloads after 6 years. We're certainly not at that 4,600 in 1 week, but it does bring up an interesting question. Where do we stand in the plant space, and how do we generate interest and increase our numbers? Because I could tell you, just looking at the metrics, and say we have seen a decrease in listenership, and that could be for a number of reasons. And one of the biggest reasons I could think of is just the crowded space of audio-only podcasts. It's hard when you look at the metrics. You can say across all of our 70 episodes, we've had 71,978 listens. So about 1,000 listens per episode. And only 20% of those are from Spotify. Does that tell us that a majority of people are not listening to our podcast through Spotify? And does that reflect on the age demographics of who's listening to us and how they're listening to us? I'm thinking a lot about these. I hate to break it down into numbers, but when you're thinking about the sustainability of a podcast, you think about, okay, where are we at? How do we grow? Because you can't grow if you don't know what your number is, right? And how can you make adjustments to grow and increase listenership so that you can help to generate interest in plant pathology on a larger scale?
Now, there was a lot in that what you just shared. So it's interesting to know what the trends are. Since I am no longer in your seat, I've been tracking those metrics. So it's interesting to see that change. You're right that the space, just the podcast space in general, is a lot more crowded. I question whether more listeners is great. And we're sitting down here in what probably the top 2, 3% of podcasts, maybe. So if we do want to get to number one, we have to grow that listenership. But at the same time, I'm interested in sort of the quality of that listener. Who are our listeners, and are we reaching an audience that really wants to know about plant pathology? And I think about maybe I'm bringing it back to the personal journeys. The fact that so many of us think of plant pathology as a discovery science, and we get in this field when we step in it, sometimes literally, because we think we're on a different career path early in our lives, and then we find this amazing field called plant pathology. So, one of the key roles that I have always imagined Plantopia might play is to help early career professionals discover this science that will be their life's passion, and maybe they just don't know that yet. So that question about who the listeners is really critical to me. Can you give us kind of a broad brushstroke understanding of who the typical Plantopia listener is?
We don't have that in the metrics. What we have is, 1 day, 7 day, 30 day, 90 day total listenership by episode. I don't think we collect any metrics beyond that because a lot of them, again, most of these are coming from the website. So you would just go to the Plantopia podcast website and listen to it, stream it there. There may be metrics that internally Spotify keeps, but those aren't ones that we track. And I don't know if there are ways to do that. But I do wonder who those people are. Clearly, there's a number of people that have been guests before that listen, and people that are really involved with APS and serve in various roles on committees and that. But I think we could get to more of our membership. We're certainly not having a majority of our members listen because our
Mhm.
numbers, I think, would be higher. But I think we would just benefit from having broader listenership within our membership directory. So I think there's a disconnect there, and I think we need to help connect the podcast with those members because I know this advertisements are being distributed across social media platforms and things like that. But I think it comes back to one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is like audio only. Like when I talk to my 15-year-old and about what he's watching in YouTube Shorts, very short video content that could, I think, in a way, complement the audio. We want to have snippets of the best audio, 2 minutes put into video form, and that way we can draw people to the full length thing. Typically, sometimes you find something interesting, you're like, I want to hear that whole interview. So I think we're missing out because we're not taking advantage of this fact that a lot of people want to see video, even if it's just pictures. It doesn't have to be actual captured video from the podcast. That would be nice too, but that's challenging for a number of reasons as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It certainly is on trend right now. And I was just watching a podcast,
Yeah,
and it really struck me how a podcast is basically becoming television in some form. So
yeah.
it does seem like there's a movement from audio only to mixed media.
But I want to come back to something you said. You were talking about the quality of the episodes, the quality of who are our listeners. I care about all of our listeners, of course, and the ones that have been listening to all the episodes. That's great. We want you to keep listening. We don't want to change it in a way that's going to drive our core listenership away, but we want to supplement the experience maybe by providing short format video, and maybe that's what a new host or co-host can do. Maybe we need someone not necessarily to keep doing what we're doing here in the audio content, but it's taking those small pieces of audio that like best 60 seconds and turning into mixed media content for short format video and that across different social media platforms because I think in that way we can drive a lot of traffic back to the full length podcast episodes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I like that. I think it is really consistent with what we're seeing and serving APS membership, serving our Plantopia listenership in different ways, I'm all for that.
And I want to also be clear about something else. Even if our listenership didn't change, even if it went down, I still think there's value in the podcast. And for the sole reason that it's archiving the stories of plant pathologists in our profession that have contributed to our field. And I come back to one of the episodes that was really popular for me that I was a host on with Dr. Manon Gallagly, who's since passed, Plant Pathology 101, which was one of my earlier episodes. And it served as a great way to capture some of his great stories from his early career, his long storied career, but also served as a way to teach people about his contributions when we were fundraising to create a named travel award for him. So in that way, we were able to use the podcast in two ways. We could then use it for storytelling, for saying, this is someone who contributed greatly to our profession, and we want to honor him with this. And we were able to do that. And I feel really grateful that we had captured that audio because it wasn't long thereafter that he passed. So I think just archiving the stories of our late career stage plant pathologist, I think that's enough. But I think we could be more.
Yeah, you just brought up something that's so critical, though. The APS is more than 100 years old, and we have a very rich history and a dynamic future ahead of us, too. So capturing that information, or at least some part of that information now, is in a critical role. But Plantopia and really the multifaceted outputs of APS, I think, serve our society in very different ways. And so I think you're really hitting on something critical here. One piece, as you were articulating the role of Plantopia, one piece that came to mind is integration of some of our journals and some of the great research that's coming out in APS journals. Can we use Plantopia to highlight some of that? Maybe it's a periodic conversation with the editor and associate editor, some of the journals, about what they're really excited about in the moment. That seems like an opportunity that I personally would love to see.
Yeah, absolutely. That comes back to that, like, different categories. Do we have episodes that feature the stories of plant pathologists? Yes. Do we have ones that are more like a supplement for a plant pathology lecture? That's more,
Right.
yes, it speaks to the general public, but it like actually defines terms as if you were giving an actual formal lecture and can be used that way. I know personally, like, what motivated some of those episodes were during that semester I recorded them, I was teaching general plant pathology. So I deliberately, I didn't seek out the topic, but the way I approached the episode was such that I could then ask the students to listen to it, not as a requirement, as like for extra credit to listen to it, and then forcing them to listen to another plant pathologist. But several of them came back. They're like, I really enjoyed listening to that. Like, I learned a lot. And it like, the things we're learning in class are relevant because you were talking about them. So, in that way, it was great to actually make that connection between the classroom, the Plantopia episode, and say, it's not just about a conversation. It's like you become a more educated listener, and you could start to understand these concepts, and understanding how infectious disease works is important. Understanding what a pathogen is important.
I love that. That's really brilliant. And it makes me think, if you have 70, we have 70 episodes of Plantopia out there. It seems like really a treasure trove that could be mined by an instructor who's particularly passionate about different ways of learning. You had talked about creating a multimedia approach to this, and I could imagine snippets of Plantopia being integrated into a learning module that has some sort of a visual component to that, where some of those terms are being defined, where some of the, maybe it's a disease that we're discussing, is actually being showcased. That could actually be a really powerful educational tool.
And I think just a simple addition to the website where you are able to bin these episodes and say, if you wanted teaching resources for general plant pathology, check out episode 1, 14, 23, and then explain what each of them does as something that like the committee could decide on, that we feel like this provides a good foundation for these things. But it's not something where I can be like, oh yeah, of course all my episodes should be there. No, it's like something where the counselor or could decide these might be useful for repackaging, because the double dip is important in academia, to be able to get more than one thing out of a deliverable. Is, yes, you have an episode, but you also have educational content and these other things.
I could see a collaboration with our education committee, the APS education committee on something like this.
That would be great. We're obviously hitting on a lot of different things here. I wanted to go back and talk about your experience as a host of Plantopia, and I'm happy to follow up and share my own. But one of the things we're doing here is we're helping explain the process and what's involved with podcasting for maybe the potential next host. But I'd love to hear about your most memorable experience as host of Plantopia and what made it that special, or it could be something that surprised you that ended up being some of the most memorable experience you had. But do you have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind actually, and it was really fun and a real honor to be a host of Plantopia. I'm inherently curious, I think. So I genuinely want to know about people. I want to know about their research. Being the host, that was fun because I could be a little bit nosy and ask questions that I might not otherwise ask, but I was doing it for the good of the society. And there were certainly certain episodes that stood out as are my personal favorites. But I think that the thing that surprised me the most about being Plantopia host is going to APS meetings, plant health meetings, and having folks come up to me and say, I listen to Plantopia all the time, and I'm really excited about that. There was one in, I believe it was in our Pittsburgh meeting. One listener, I will not share names, but one listener came up and said, I'm going to fangirl on you a little bit. I listen to Plantopia all the time. So that was just, you know, but it is.
Yeah, I must speak to you as a host because I've never had anybody come up to me and say, I listen to Plantopia. They just look, give me a sneer. So maybe that's why my listenership that numbers are.
Okay, listeners, send Matt some personal love. He's just what really stood out though was that there are folks in our society, and it often, in my experience, was often an early career professional, so perhaps a grad student or somebody early in their professional career that really voiced value for Plantopia. And back to your point about demographics, I think there probably is a sort of a particular demographic component of our society that listens to Plantopia. Podcasts in general, I'm not saying anything about Plantopia, but I think podcasts are probably consumed by, I would guess, a younger listener, so somebody who maybe a little more early career. And I don't know what to do with that information. I think there's real value there in knowing who the listeners are because it can help us shape the direction of the podcast a bit. But it was circumstantial, but it was fun for me to connect with folks that otherwise I might go to the meeting and never have the pleasure of saying hello to.
Yeah. I think for me, just learning about a lot of the subfields, deliberately seeking out people that were bacteriologists or working in a system, in a crop system, or with a group of pathogens that, I knew about from my education, but really I wasn't up to speed on what was happening with work around those topics. I think that was a lot of fun. Of course, I go back to talking. I developed a really strong friendship with Manning Gallagly, who was here at WVU for his whole career. And part of that, interviewing him, I got to know him better and got closer to him. So that was really special for me. And it felt really good to actually be able to give that to his family when he passed. I'm like, they have like his audio of him doing this, and it's that exists forever, hopefully. I don't know what's going to happen to the internet 1,000 years from now, 200 years from now, but presumably that's going to live on forever. And it feels important to be able to capture those stories.
Amazing.
It's funny, I looked at some of the metrics, and the episode that has the top 1 day downloads is one of your episodes. And it's one of your episodes with, I'm guessing, was your favorite guest, me. But it actually, I really enjoyed the episode doing that interview with you. It got me excited and for podcasting. And I, historically speaking, I wasn't a big podcast listener, maybe Planet Money, some other things, but I really started to think about it. And I've spent a lot of time over the last 2+ years just thinking about how to talk to people and what types of questions to ask, how to ask a question, how to balance humor and seriousness and these things. So I think that you obviously served as a good role model in that way, but I enjoyed the frankness of the conversation, coming back to this whole idea that it wasn't just about the science, it was about the person. And I think I've tried to carry that forward because that to me is the most compelling part of some of these episodes.
Me too. I've loved what you've done with the podcast. And you framed, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but in my mind, you framed Plantopia as one of many ways that we as professional scientists talk science to a broader audience. And science communication has always been a passion of mine. It's something that I think there's room for professional communicators. There's a need for professional communicators to work in the space. There's also a need for professional scientists to hone their own skills and to be able to articulate that. And that takes many different forms. And it can be social media, like back in the Twitter days, or now YouTube or TikTok, a podcast. There are many different
Blue Sky, don't forget about
Blue
Blue Sky.
Sky.
Yeah.
And so there are many different ways in which science communication takes shape. And I think that continues to evolve, which is fun. It's also a challenge as a host of a podcast or as a scientist who's really interested in connecting with a broader public. Staying on top of the trends, not necessarily being trendy, but knowing what opportunities are out there and positioning our time in this space to be really effective. It's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to talk about on that topic. So I think it's a good point that science communication takes on many different forms. And if we go back to even when you and I recorded the episode where you interviewed me, at that time I was what you called a power user on Twitter. And social media used to be the way that I communicated science, and I loved it. And I built a huge following, and it was really enjoyable until it wasn't. And we leave social media for various reasons, and that's not really relevant to this discussion, only to say that I still had this huge desire to communicate science when I left social media, and I had no outlet to do that. And then I got into writing popular science, and then I got into serving as host of Plantopia, and I found that the kind of serotonin and these types of positive feelings that I got from using social media transferred over, and I got that same feeling when I started doing Plantopia the more I did it. And it's really important. What I like about it more than social media is that if you're an academic that's thinking about being a host, it's very easy to justify it as and talk about it as service to your profession. No doubt. I think one of the things I talked about when I gave a talk at the Potomac Division meeting because they had a special symposium called One Science, Many Audiences, Approaches to Communicating Plant Pathology. And I was there to represent talking about Plantopia. And one of the things I pulled the curtain back on was the time commitment to doing one episode. And I used a kind of extreme case as an example because we had a multi-guest episode, episode 69, which was a conversation with 4 clinic directors of the NPDN. And between the coming up with questions and the correspondence and the 2 separate tapings and the post-production on my end, I think it was 15 hours of work, which on average, this is 5 to 8% of my of a standard 48-hour work month, I should say, maybe. But it's totally reportable as service to your profession. And my university loves the fact that I'm host of a podcast for my professional society. What better way to show that you're giving back to communicate science while you're doing something for your professional society?
You are a rock star. It's amazing to know a little bit about your process behind the scenes to prep for an episode here. So hats off.
Well, generally, it's not that long. That was an interesting one because we actually had basically two episodes emerged into one. But it still takes multiple hours per month to get an episode out. Yeah, there is a time commitment there, but then you have an archive of these episodes. It's like hanging a nice painting on a wall. It's something that you helped to create, and you can always look over the wall and say, I was a part of that. And it's not just because it's you in it. It's your interaction with the guest. It's how it's opened your eyes to a whole new subfield of plant pathology or to a whole new technique or approach to our science that you didn't think about before. And it may actually inspire you to seek out a different type of guest. The last episode I did was with a lobbyist. And I'll tell you what, there's a lobbyist that lobbies on behalf of APS on topics of plant health in DC for us. And it was such an interesting conversation because, as I disclosed in the interview, I didn't know any lobbyists before I interviewed her. So it was really eye-opening to learn, pull back the curtain on that. What is lobbying? And it's not a bad word, but there's a lot of people lobbying on behalf of environmental issues and nonprofit groups that are trying to advance topics of the environment and plant health and things like that.
So, Matt, I'm going to ask you a question, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, but you've brought up a couple times in this episode the prospect of a new host or a co-host. What are your thoughts in that space?
I'll say the reason I think it would be good to have a new host or a co-host is not because I don't enjoy the job. As I've just said, this is a means for me to keep being part of the SciComm community. So I feel like I'm contributing in that way. But I think as a society who really advocates for inclusiveness, having had three white guys as a host and not mid to later career guys, it'd be good to have some other perspectives because we all have our own lived experiences. Yeah, we study different things, and some of us may come from more privileged backgrounds, some of us may have grown up poor, these other things. But the more voices we can represent, the more our listeners can say, you know what, that's me. That's me talking. And that's part of getting diverse guests on is that they could say that's me talking. But wouldn't it be great if they could also point to the host and say that's me talking? It's not just about bringing on guests that represent who they are. It's also having hosts and giving space for diverse voices to be heard.
Yeah, I love that. And certainly everyone connected with this podcast has had really explicit conversations around inclusion, different perspectives, different opinions, different career stages. And what you're articulating, I think it's really incredibly valuable. And one of the, like you, I loved my time as host, Plantopia. And after 2 seasons, I felt that there was really a need and opportunity for sort of a new perspective for the podcast to continue to grow in different directions. And I hear you articulating a form of that too, and I share that.
Maybe this is the point at which I realized that there's no check arriving. I was holding out hope for over 2 years that I would get paid for this. I'm just joking, of course. That's the thing, like, I really feel that the time I put into this has been worth it. It's giving back to my society. APS has given me a lot of opportunities in terms of travel awards and, all kinds of professional development. But I think that there's people listening to the same person. There are definitely people that have that voice that you can listen to forever. I don't think I have one of those voices.
David Gaguri did.
I think David does. Certainly, David does. But I feel like I have a lot of nasality, and I feel like there are things about me. People listen to me because they have no other choice. But I think if they or that or just going into these multiple guest episodes, I really enjoyed the synergy and the cross exchange that happened and talking with these four directors of the NPDN. That was such a great episode. And I think just having additional voices in that audio space really brightens up the episodes.
Yeah, I love that you're trying different things. This really is a dynamic kind of living creature. And I'm just grateful that you've been a really effective host and that you're thinking about the future of this and how things are changing, how this podcast should change. So you really sell yourself short. So thank you
Well,
for what you've been doing.
I appreciate that. And I'll say that I feel that I've been effective, but I also feel that I've had ideas that I haven't followed through on. It'd be nice to do episodes from the lab and from these other things. And these were ideas that I think you and I even talked about when you interviewed me, or actually maybe when I interviewed you as I was taking over. We talked about some of these things, and some of them haven't been realized yet. But it's also there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that you don't know about. Might want a guest and they don't respond, or like we're also balancing doing this with our regular everyday jobs, and that's challenging too. And you add in the fact that we're like whole humans with lives outside of our jobs. There's only so many hours in a day or a week or a month, but I think overall, I went into it with an idea of what it was. I think it is what it turned out to be that, and I've been able to grow in that way. But I think that there's room for other people to certainly add their perspectives. We're closing in on the end of time here and thinking about someone that may be on the fence about potentially serving a role as a host or a co-host. Do you have any advice or words of encouragement for maybe a listener that wants to step up and do this? And what would you tell them?
It's fantastic. I would say go for it. I think Matt, you've really articulated what a unique opportunity, unique privilege it is to serve APS in this capacity, and how it really is an extension of our impact individually, collectively. Certainly for academics, service is either an implicit or explicit expectation of our role. And this is really a fantastic way to serve plant pathology. I'm afraid you scared some potential hosts or co-hosts off articulating your 15 hours of prep work that went into your episode. And it shows. I want to stress that I think you've been a fantastic host. I've been maybe a little more off the cuff than you have, though, I'm realizing, because I probably spent about 2 or 3 hours a month prepping for it. I always tried to balance having prepared enough that I could ask intelligent questions, but also leaving a lot of space for the conversation to evolve. So I think the take home I'm trying to articulate is that being a host or a co-host, incredibly impactful. It's a lot of fun. It is work, absolutely, but it's, in my experience, was pretty manageable.
And also, I think this speaks to how talkative I am, because in the post-production, when I'm editing out content, it's mostly just reducing the amount of time that I'm actually talking, because I feel like I spend so much time talking. I'll be like 10 sentences, and then the guest will be like, yes. And then I'll go 10 sentences. And so a lot of that is manually culling out some of my blabbermouth. So maybe in a sense, you are better about letting guests talk.
The art of the pregnant pause, I think, is a very effective tool.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. And this has been great. And I do hope that we'll find someone that brings to this podcast what David, what you, what myself, and maybe even have a vision for bringing it into a future space, and allow it to organically evolve into something that will continue to tell the stories of plant pathologists and the plant pathogens they study, but also become something new and exciting that we might not even be able to think about yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone is on the fence, as Matt says, and you just want to have a private conversation about what it's like, reach out to Matt or reach out to myself. Happy to have that conversation.
Thank you for joining current and former hosts of Plantopia Podcast. If you would like to provide feedback or share ideas for future podcast episodes, be sure to check out our companion piece in an upcoming issue of Phytopathology News. I'm Matt Kasson, host of Plantopia. As always, thanks for listening.